Hi everyone and welcome back to our channel. My name is Tony and today we're gonna have another expert video. This time the topic is not quite ordinary for our AML compliance topics or ML compliance sphere, which is the FTX demise or FTX crash and Sam Bankman-Fried. You could see that we haven't released expert videos for quite a while, and this was actually because I was thinking how to look at this specific accident or this situation from which angle, because there's so many angles. All of them were so much delicious. Look at this. John Ray III, who is the bankruptcy CEO of FTX, and he was formerly handling the bankruptcy of Enron, a very famous case with the same level of, let's say, tectonic impact on global economy and finance. And we see right now these tectonic changes that were created by FTX demise. And he is talking in the Congress, and he's explaining how serious were the violations and simple mismanagement in FTX.
They use QuickBooks, a multi-billion-dollar company using QuickBooks.
QuickBooks?
QuickBooks.
No board of directors, poor practices of management. They used emojis as the way to approve multi-million transfers from one bank to another. Hundreds of legal entities, what he called silos, because they had no connections with each other in most cases, and random bank accounts in random jurisdictions, as well as idle crypto wallets that are really hard to find and to recover, and probably some of them are still controlled by the former team of FTX. The irony that Sam Bankman-Fried was sitting in the same chair in the Congress just a year before, talking about, in December 2021, talking about the future of digital assets and how to regulate them.
It's an honor to be here.
All this fancy and most reputable VCs that invested in this business, seemingly without any due diligence. They didn't know about all of this. The ESG rating of FTX was so high, again, no due diligence. Billions of dollars in the hands of almost Zoomers. SBF himself, his personality, he was definitely selling more himself than the company, although he had a business which he could run normally, but instead of that, he, for some reason, chose these backdoors and these strange transactions, FTTs, etc., which was not really important in this case, as opposed to other cases like this. Look at Theranos of Elizabeth Holmes, and where there was no product whatsoever all the time, and Charlie Javis, Frank, where there was no real database of customers. Here, there was a product and everything, but for some reason SBF chose to do business in a not normal way. Look at this team that he had, a very close team, including, for example, his right hand, Caroline Ellison, a very strange character. I would say more a character of Harry Potter movies rather than financial world, and her mysterious connections, or her family's mysterious connections with high-profile authorities in the US, including allegedly Gary Gensler of SSC, and all this public image of struggle for public good and altruistic capitalism, etc. And on the other hand, we see creative approaches to the business. We see embezzlement of money of the investors and customers. We see endless misrepresentations to the investors and the public. And above all, this fake it until you make it mentality that is so much typical for all startups. And I think that's That's something that we should concede. And at the same time, in these cases, we see that they make it part of this mentality or of this approach has been postponed or suspended over and over and over again. So we have similar cases like this. Elizabeth Holmes is Theranos and Charlie Javis is Frank. Both of them ended up in criminal courts, just as Sam Bankman as well. And all these aspects, obviously, that I have mentioned, they obviously deserve a separate video or a separate article. But when I started thinking about this, I started realizing that we are missing something, and most of the articles, most of the videos, they actually miss something that is the most important here, and which actually produces circumstances in which this can actually happen. I look at this as a combination of certain, let's say, economical and sociological, and at the same time psychological things that make a personality, let's say, develop in this way. In the way that is pathological, that a person lies even when it's not necessary to lie, when the person chooses to have backdoors in his business instead of just doing a normal way without anything like that, or when the person sees that the business does not have a product really, instead of doing some pivot or some fork, the person, this entrepreneur, just goes on and tries to continue the business as is. I invited for this talk our friend Graham Barrow, who is not only a prominent AML expert and the director of Dark Money Files, but he has spent quite a lot of time studying psychology, and therefore we can cover this topic, this phenomenon, the phenomenon of I would say pathological liars in startup economy, not only from the economic or compliance side, but also from the psychological standpoint. Let's talk with Graham.
Why we have this problems over and over again?
Well, first of all, it's not a new phenomenon. It may be different these days, but if you go back to the 17th, 18th century, they had a similar situation in Holland, in the Netherlands, with tulip bulbs. People would spend a year's salary buying one tulip bulb because suddenly everyone wanted to have the very, very best tulip. The young people have this thing called FOMO, fear of missing out. There is something that's fundamentally human about what we're seeing, which has always been there, but something else fundamentally different because we live in a connected world. The consequences of that mass hysteria are more profound simply because more people know about it.
Yes, but what we have right now, we have lots of things that actually should preserve real economy from fraudsters. For example, let's say ESG ratings. And we have, in cases of theranos, and in case of FTX, obviously they had a lot of rounds of investments, and these investors were supposed to evaluate the company and were supposed to do due diligence, but they actually didn't.
Incontrovertibly, it doesn't matter how many controls you have, how strong your control environment is. Ultimately, it is subject to the human risk of the people who administer it. It is extraordinary how often rules can be bent, let's say, when the desire to bend them is very, very strong, because the cost of obeying the rules might mean that you miss out. You don't want to miss out. So, and I guess add to that, in both of those technologies, the fact that people didn't really understand either of them. They didn't want to look stupid. There's a Yiddish word, Chutzpah. You've got to have the nerve to do these things. Now, Elizabeth Holmes actually had this massive corporate headquarters that was costing allegedly $1 million a month. Yeah. Huge. There was about 15 people in there. But she's selling a dream. And SBF was selling a dream. And if you can get enough people to give you the money and go and do that, the more you do that, the more the dream looks real, and people get caught up in the dream that I want part of that. So I think you have this perfect storm of charismatic and photogenic in some way or other people who had a lot of chutzpah, who alighted on a project that caught the public's imagination. You could say the same about ChatGPT, but the big difference is, incontrovertibly, I've asked ChatGPT some interesting questions. The speed of the response could not be a human being. There is not a human being alive that could have responded so well to my questions so instantly. So we know that the engine behind ChatGPT is real. And then there's a conversation about whether it's dangerous or not, but that's a separate one. But we know it's real because we see evidence of it. Never really saw evidence of either theranos or SPF.
I don't know the owner of GPT. I mean, who is this guy? We don't know. Like, it's not definitely it's not that level of
not being sold. It's not being sold on a personality. Yeah. No, absolutely right. Absolutely right.
Yeah.
And we should learn from that. Are you buying the product or are you buying the person? So it is really interesting. But I think your point you made right at the beginning is one we should go back to, which is it also caught up with regulators and investors, people who are supposed to be either robust or shrewd, depending on regulator or investor, but they managed to suspend their disbelief. Now, it's odd because if you go back to, I have a great love for Tolkien and the Lord of the Rings stories, and
yes, of course.
And he would say the same. My job is to get you not to believe, but to suspend your disbelief. It's not quite the same thing, but that's what Bankman Fried managed to do with regulators and investors. They suspended their disbelief that this all looks too good to be true enough for them to either allow it to happen or to put their money into it. And I think it is a really interesting conversation that gets overshadowed by our focus on rules and regulations.
If we look at the personal stories of SBF and Elizabeth Holmes, it's interesting that they both are from the families of professors. At the same time, Elizabeth was a dropout from her university.
Yep.
Sam was good. Sam was successful in the university, and then he was kind of like a dropout. And his job, it doesn't look like he was like very successful in his career. It seems that they have something in common, which is they were not really successful before they started their businesses.
If you look at Richard Branson as another example, Richard Branson was dyslexic and had a rotten time at school and really, really, really hated school. So I think there is this residual kind of, I will show you, this desire to prove your worth. And I guess in some respects, the more difficult the background. Having a professor for a father is probably a bit crap because they're a professor and somehow you've got to live up to that. And if you're not naturally academic, that can be, very problematic. Having said that, there'll be lots of people who have had very, very, very capable fathers and they weren't successful no matter how much they wanted to prove them wrong. So we still have to be careful not to extrapolate too much from the notoriety or success of people, to apply a general rule, because I'm not sure you can.
Another thing which is related to that actually, because when you are a person who is dropout, or when you're a person who had not a good memories about their own career, you are thinking about some kind of backdoors.
Yeah,
and we see in some of the interviews that were recently published about Elizabeth Holmes. It seems that she used some backdoors in her earlier life, and we obviously see that SBF was doing the same many times. It seems that for a certain group of people that are building their businesses, at a certain moment they start feeling that it's always better to find some backdoor instead of go in normal way. Which is something that then leads to the way how to steal money or to pretend that you have something that you don't have, et cetera, et cetera. What do you think about this?
I think that's been a feature throughout history. It reminded me, Ghislaine Maxwell, who's been in the news obviously around the Epstein case. Her father, Robert Maxwell, got himself into extremely difficult financial situation back in the in the UK in the 70s, and decided to raid his company's pension scheme. Now, he was convinced at the time that it was just a temporary raid and that he would come good and everything would be fine. But his backdoor was, well, I'm going to borrow from the pension scheme, borrow, in inverted commas, from the pension scheme. And of course, and then he went bust. And the consequence of that was thousands and thousands of pensioners lost their pension. So, I think you can get this kind of they're called delusions of grandeur. You believe that you are inviolable, you are invincible, you can't be beaten. So you will take these backdoor routes sometimes, utterly convinced that it's a temporary thing, because you are going to become so successful in the end. You can replace the things that you shouldn't have done with the right things, and it'll be fine because you'll be successful and it won't matter. And of course, it is those same delusions that stop you from seeing that you are now on a path that you can't recover from, because you always think it's like the gambler, isn't it? They're one bet away from success. It's not how it works.
I would also bring here another parallel, which is serial killers.
Yes,
it's very interesting because most of these people they kill because a certain moment they discover they killed, and nobody actually found them. It's kind of like hidden success for them. Nobody knows about this, about the thing that they cheated to a certain extent, or they killed someone. And there is some psychologically, it's a close thing. It's some kind of this idea.
Very wise guy here in the UK. His name was C. Heathcote Parkinson. He's very famous for having written Parkinson's Law, which a lot of people have. Parkinson's Law says that work will expand to fill the time allotted in which to do it, which is good, because it's it doesn't matter what you give people to do, they will always make it last as long as it needs to last. But he wrote something else which I think is actually more powerful, which is this. He said, if you deprive people of the ability to make decisions of importance, they will attach importance to those decisions that they are allowed to make.
Oh, that's very clever.
He was making the point that people want to feel that they have some value, some worth. And probably one of the things that does think, serial killers is what reminded me, because very often these people are actually socially difficult. And the act of killing, it's not specifically they want to kill people, but it gives them a feeling of worth, of power, of doing something notable. And that becomes addictive because they don't have those feelings in their day-to-day lives. And I think generally, the example Parkinson uses is the office manager who's not really a manager. So he will decide the most important thing in the office is that you have the correct office stationery on your desk at all times. Well, it doesn't really matter, but if that's the only thing they have power over, it will become important. And it's just a really, really useful thing to remember that if you do not allow people to make decisions of importance, they will attach importance to any decisions they're allowed to make.
And they will make other people actually evaluate these decisions at a certain moment and invest in these decisions.
Yes,
and here actually, this brings me to my main point, I would say, that I have at the moment, which is, is there some pathology in startuppers? Let's say most of the startuppers they are actually selling something that does not exist at the moment. They're selling something that they will earn later. So they can believe in this, and they can lie at the same time. And sometimes they can believe and lie at the same time. That's the problem. I'm thinking about this right now as if this is important for startuppers to lie and believe in the same time. Because if they don't believe, they will not build anything. At the same time, they should lie, because otherwise they will not sell anything. So they need to lie and believe at the same time. And if they believe in their own lies, this is already some pathological thing. So it's not a normal condition when the person knows that he's lying, at the same time he believes in his lies.
Yeah, I think that's really, really interesting point. One of the things about, obviously, anyone who has goes down the route of startup has to have a capacity to take risk, because there's no way you can have a startup that is risk-free. Now, psychologically, risk is a really important subject, because there is no objective measure of risk. Risk is always psychological. Risk is the amount of peril that you personally are prepared to accept in order to go down the path that you wish to go down. So with investments, for example, what somebody would call high risk, somebody else say, no, that's not risky at all. I can tell you what high risk is. So there is no empirical measure of risk. It is entirely your own ability to deal with it. Now, anyone who goes down the route of a startup, inherently has a pretty resilient approach to our response to risk, because it's inherent. Now, the psychological factors that make you willing to accept high levels of risk have other consequences, and one of which is that the risks, let's say, of telling lies can be easily diminished, because in the whole scheme of things, it's just another part of getting to where you want to be. And hey, it doesn't matter that much because it's going to be a fantastic success and it'll all be fine in the end. And if you've got a startup, you want it to succeed quickly. So a quick lie is often preferred to a long truth, because that's boring and we want to be instant millionaires these days. So it is a very seductive route to be able to hold those two things in your head at the same time, which is the desire to tell the truth, but the willingness to lie.
If we are talking about, let's say Elizabeth Holmes, they were accounts that some interviews with experts who were calling her sociopath and also psychopath.
Yeah.
And I was reading about this. I'm not a psychologist, obviously, but one of interesting things that came to my mind and what I read was, again, and this refers to serial killers as well. They have they're really resilient to risk, much more than others.
Yeah, there's a reason for that.
So they are resilient to risk. They, at the same time, they can play very well a normal person. So you will never know that if this person is not a normal person.
Mm-hmm.
There will be an absolutely good mask on the face that everything is fine.
I think that's true of psychopaths. I think sociopaths, that may not be quite so.
Okay, yeah. So social, yeah. I
Sociopaths are actually quite easy. Right. Psychopaths, on the other hand, are very, very adept at presenting themselves.
Exactly. Yeah.
No, absolutely.
So because from the very early times of their lives, they understood that they're different and they should act like a normal person.
Yeah, and that's the difference. So Donald Trump, I would say, is a sociopath. You don't have to agree with me. That's my personal point of view. He's and that's because he just has no idea of how he comes over to a lot of people. He in his worldview, he is being entirely reasonable and logical and rational and all the rest of it. Whereas others, I think, now a psychopath is a much more dangerous creature, because they would actually be an exceptionally good presenting themselves in the right way to most people, and underneath all that be operating at a very different level and have quite Machiavellian desires and intents. So I think that's a really important difference. I guess the one similarity is that they both do tend to be risk takers. One, because they just have no consequence of the risk that they're taking, because they will. That's a sociopath. It just doesn't see it as a risk. It's just that the world. Psychopath would have worked it all out and be prepared to accept those risks, because the desire to dominate or whatever is so powerful that it will overrule the risks involved.
And so for other people, they will just look as very courageous people that you should follow.
Yes. Jim Jones would be a good example. So if you remember Jim Jones, he was the guy in Guyana who had the suicide cult. So he persuaded 700 odd people to willingly take a spoonful of, lethal poison.
Yes. I would say that SBF probably is sociopath, and Elizabeth is probably a psychopath.
I don't know. Elizabeth is much harder to read. She is. Sam Bankman Fried, what you see is always what you get, which is an oddball. I would be absolutely convinced that he is, definitively on the autistic spectrum, but that's not uncommon with sociopaths. Not obviously not autists. Not all autists are sociopathic, but actually that kind of lying on the fringes of what is considered normal behavior is common to both.
And for both, it's a very common thing to take a lot of risk on themselves, and be okay with that.
Yes, I mean autism is quite odd in that respect, because you get very, very some autists are completely oblivious to the rules of society and just go their own merry ways. Others are absolutely rigidly stuck to the rules. So there's it's a spectrum. It's called a spectrum for a reason, because there are so many ways of manifesting. Sociopaths are just fit in a relatively small place.
Many startuppers are actually it is possible. It is very likely that these people are not normal, and that they have these features, that they take a lot of risk without being problematic with that. So this means that this kind of a path, it attracts people with this kind of differences.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not trying to be critical. I'm kind of a bit careful about using the word normal, because I'm not sure that such a thing absolutely exists. I'm not sure that there is a defined normal. I think what they are, and Malcolm Gladwell got this right, I think they are outliers, by which I mean that their traits tend to be at the end of a spectrum of possibilities, and often they're grouped so that they can have quite, outlying personality traits. So that might be introversion, extroversion, it might be gregarious. There's a whole range of things it might be, but I think they tend to be outliers because people who are, in the center of that spectrum tend not to have the personalities that lend themselves to the joys or perils of being a startupper. I mean, it's not a smooth and easy ride. So, I mean, most of my family are not risk takers, and look at what I do, and so, how can you deal with the consequences of that? And for me, and my wife is exactly the same. It's just like, oh yeah, but if you never take a chance in life, you never get anywhere. But some people don't want to take a chance in life, and that's not a criticism. They are very happy with their lives.
What we are talking about, this is a separate thing, which is that these kind of categories of people, they are not able to pursue normal careers because they have their own psychological problems. They are supervised when they're in a company, in a huge company. They're supervised by other people, and they cannot stand this, obviously, because they have this differences. Some of these people that are in these careers, normal careers, they become serial killers.
Yeah.
Because they need some other secret life, and they feel that they need something out of this system that they would do, and some of them are becoming, because of this, they are becoming serial killers. Those who do not real serial killers, they just pursue another career, which is to build their own company.
Yeah, and there's all shades in between. So lots of people now become internet trolls, because they don't want to be a serial killer, but on the other hand, they want to have something which makes them different from the average person. And the internet allows them to do all sorts of terrible things virtually without any consequence, because they are anonymous. I mean, I've only spent a very few years of my life employed. I do not fit comfortably in employment. I am not an easy person to manage, and I would put my hand up to that and say I am difficult, because I just have a way of looking at the world which doesn't always fit within a corporate environment, which is why I have my own business. I'm not a Bankman Fried, and I'm definitely not a serial killer. So I'm somewhere on that spectrum. So, but because we live in a world where the more extreme you are, the more attention you get, and people are now playing to that. So social media influencers. I mean, Andrew Tate would be a fantastic example of that. So in a way, we feed on these people, and the more we do that, the more they believe in themselves, and the more risk they take, and the worse it can get. Sometimes the better it can get, because Jeff Bezos maybe can become incredibly successful, but we don't know that at the outset. And by the time we find out, it's almost always too late.
I see two problems here. So one problem is for venture capitalists, how they should act in order to be sure that they at least are to a certain extent secured against these kind of people, because you never know, right?
Yeah.
But it seems with especially with the story of Sam Bankman-Fried, it seems that they were absolutely not cautious. And second thing is for startuppers themselves, because I see, of course, that when you talk to the person like Sam Bankman-Fried, for example, he is absolutely sure that he is a normal person and that he is okay, and everything that he did was fine, and he was just a victim of circumstances, etc. I'm sure that Elizabeth Holmes is just the same. So when you talk to them, you will never see any real regrets or anything. They thought that they did absolutely fine, right? And that's exactly what they said all the time to everyone, including investors. So it seems that they got in some psychological traps. So two questions. One question is for venture capitalists, how not to get into this trouble. And second thing for startuppers themselves, how not to get into this psychological trap.
So I think some of the VCs, I think actually all the VCs I've ever met have actually said, we don't know. We cannot, doesn't matter how careful we are. And one of the reasons why we tend to spread our funds across, because actually probably only 1 in 10 or 1 in 20 or whatever is going to be a really big success. But if it is, it will cover us for all the ones that aren't. But because you never know at outset which ones really will work, you just accept that there will be failures amongst, more failures than successes. Now, obviously with SBF, it was a huge failure. Right. So I think that just goes with the territory of being a VC. I mean, it is called venture capital for a reason, which is, you are taking a risk with it and you don't know outset. Obviously, you would like somebody not to be an out and out criminal, but I think they both started out, Holmes and Bankman Fried, with right intent. It's just they were in a rush and couldn't be bothered to wait for their things to happen properly, so they accelerated them improperly.
It seems that they have some systemic problems. Theranos, for example, we saw interviews with some of the former employees, and they said absolutely everything was toxic and not right from the very beginning, and they were thinking about sharing it with the audience, with everyone, but they were intimidated by some talks and by some arrangements and contract. When it comes to Sam Bankman-Fried, it seems that everything was in disorder on many levels, because the whole business was run by 7 or maybe 10 people, and everybody else were just not taking decisions. They were worried as well. So when you are a VC, for example, and you are approached by the guy like this, or you are approaching a very successful business, which can be like this, what you should do?
Look, there is a sequence of steps you ought to take, which in all other, if you were being entirely rational, ought to protect you from the worst excesses there. But of course, that's not the world we live in, only. We live in a world where people have personalities and psychologies, and they may believe that they are following due process, but so let me give you an example. It's one that we're just about to use in our next podcast, oddly. Mm-hmm. I've just been on holiday with my wife, and we went to Senegal in West Africa, which was very different from our holidays. It was beautiful, and of course she wanted to do a selfie. And I don't know if you have this issue. My wife's lovely, but she's quite sensitive about photographs. So the selfie was actually about 40 selfies, of which 39 were rejected and 1 was kept, which is the view of her and where we were that she found acceptable. Now, that is human nature, which is I want to curate as much as I can of my life to match my image of what I ought to look like. And it's impossible to get rid of those feelings of, I have this view of what things should look like, and I'll make sure that the world ends up matching my view and not the other way around. So it's really, really easy even for VCs, who you'd think would be hard-headed business people, to curate what they're seeing because they want what's happening to be true. So I think just like the selfie, it is very easy to just keep saying things, saying, no, discard. Oh, no, that matches my That's my, there's confirmation bias involved here, that you think, yeah, that meets what I want it to be, so I will accept that to be true. The other stuff doesn't meet what I want it to be, so I'm going to decide that is false. And again, interestingly, both Bankman Fried and Elizabeth Holmes did something that Madoff also did, which Madoff had a separate floor with a separate unit that did all of the Ponzi stuff, kept it away from almost all of the rest of the workforce. So they also have this ability to compartmentalize so that only very few people really know what's going on, and lots just believe the publicity.
Psychopaths constitute around 1% of all population of the planet. However, in the corporate world, they are much more represented. Studies have placed the rate of psychopathy in the corporate world as anywhere between 4 and 21 times more prevalent than in the general population. In fact, psychopaths, they are absolutely sane and mentally healthy people, but they have certain personality disorder, and they usually have such traits or higher ambitions, shallow emotions, a lack of empathy, immorality, and sometimes they demonstrate antisocial behavior and deceptiveness. Kevin Dutton is a famous British psychologist and writer. He specializes in the study of psychopathy. He made a list of the types of jobs that attract the most psychopaths, and CEOs of corporate entities is their job number one. These people, they are so-called functional psychopaths. So they're functional, they usually are effective leaders, they are stress and risk takers, they are successful, they are charismatic, they're fearless. They have one problem: they're dependent on the feeling of their own success. However, some dissatisfaction of this narcissist part of their personality, given a significant problem of self-control that is typical for most psychopaths, may lead this type of a person to some antisocial and even criminal behavior. Psychopaths are fearless, and therefore they are ready to take any kinds of risks, even those that they are actually not able to really bear. At this moment, they may think of themselves as being heroic and exceptional, but this is really a psychological trap. Would you, for example, if you were hired to some kind of negotiations like that, when you meet people like that, would you be able to discern that this is a person that is probably having some problems and and what kind of instruments would you use?
Of course, I want to say yes, but I'm going to be a little careful about that. I mean, I have the benefit of having lived 69 years, so there is a certain level of experience that you get. And also, I work in a world which is almost entirely around scammers and financial crime. So I am just naturally cynical. So I genuinely think if it sounds too good to be true, it almost certainly is. So I am potentially the worst person to approach for any of this sort of stuff. The other thing I do really consciously is make sure I stay really rooted in the world that I come from. I came from a very humble background. My parents grew up in local authority housing. I grew up in local authority housing. We lived in an estate of people of relatively modest means. In our time, my wife and I have fostered children from broken homes. And I don't want to sound biased here because I'm not. I just mean sometimes you have to remember that, in the scheme of things, you're in a relatively privileged situation and lots of other people aren't. But it is a very, very useful thing to just stay anchored in that less privileged environment, because it stops you from believing, that somehow you are something that you're not. So I would like to think I would be resilient simply because most get rich quick schemes or people trying to sell me some amazing idea, I tend to say yes, but.
Okay, the last thing then, for startups themselves, because obviously when you are becoming, I'm sure, I mean, I love to look at the interviews with, for example, serial killers and other strange people. And one of the common things that they say is that I didn't really realize when exactly it started. How to find these things in yourself?
I don't think you can. So let me ask you a question. You have children.
Yes, two.
How old are they?
4 and 1.
And at what point did they stop being babies?
Stop being babies? I don't know.
You didn't see it, did you? That they went through from being born, being a baby, being a toddler. There are landmarks the first time they walk, but your kids grow up. You don't see them grow up. You don't. I mean, you see them every day, but you don't see them grow up. You never notice the changes. They just grow, and every now and again you look and think, "What the hell happened?"
Well, you can compare photos with the real.
You can, but you compare photos and you think, "But I didn't see that change happen." The change has clearly happened, but you don't see it happen because they are. I mean, they would tell you, people who do maths will tell you they're infinitesimals. You can't see them happen in real time. I think that's true of all of these things. These changes happen slowly over time, and they are not discernible on a minute by minute, hour by hour, day by day process. They just happen, and you cannot find a moment in time.
Still, I'm kind of a person that always is asking myself about different things, to check whether I'm on the right place. I'm in the right place. I don't know. I'm just trying to rationalize my life to a certain extent. So I'm asking questions to myself.
Yeah.
So what kind of questions would you recommend to ask to these kind of people to make sure that they're on the right track?
Well, I have one standard, which is particularly when I have difficult decisions, particularly in the work environment. And my standard is this: is the decision I'm going to make one that I would be prepared to defend in public, live on television, in front of an expert audience? So that's always my yardstick, always.
Okay, so I hope you really liked the talk that we had with Graham, and that you took some lessons and you found some takeaways for your business. I think that the most important takeaway is that it's important to talk to people. That's actually the most important part of KYC as well. That you need to talk to the person and make sure that the person is telling the truth. And it's very important to tell the truth when you're doing business, especially when it comes to startups. I think it's extremely important to make sure if you are the startupper or you are in the team of founders of a startup, is to make sure that nobody gets in the trap of emotional deprivation. And that happens, of course, especially when it comes to a certain moment when the startup is getting more and more money. And sometimes for some people it can be a trouble on the emotional level. And for that type of a situation, it is important to get some psychological support within the team. And of course, for ICE principle, I think is very important when it comes to running the business. It's important when the person who runs the business alone has another someone who can actually overlook as well, not in order to control, but just to make sure that the person does not make a mistake out of emotions or out of just simple lack of knowledge. If you have your own takeaways and your own considerations about this topic, about the trap of pathological lying in startup industry, let's discuss. Your comments please leave below, and take care.